Yascha Mounk, a lecturer on government at Harvard University and author of The People versus Democracy.
So speaking of the people versus democracy, you have this incredible theory, very interesting theory about, this dispute, so to speak, between popular will in our democratic system and these republican systems. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so our political system has two basic ingredients. It's a liberal democracy, which doesn't mean liberal in the sense of Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. In the sense I'm talking about, George W. Bush is as much liberal as is Barack Obama. But what it means is that, first of all, we have individual freedom. We think that our political system is meant to ensure that people actually make their own choices about how to lead their lives, who to worship or not to worship, what to say or not to say, who to be in a relationship with. And the second element, obviously, is the democratic element, which is that we also want to have some degree of self-government. We together actually decide what happens rather than some king or some general or some monarch or something like that. And my fear is that these two basic elements of our political system are far less stable together than we have long assumed, that it's possible for one to erode and then usually it'll make the other erode as well. So for a long time we've had systems that I would call undemocratic liberalism or rights without democracy, in which we've been reasonably good with some obvious limitations at respecting the rights of individuals and minorities, but relatively bad at translating popular views into public policies. And what we're seeing now, I think, is the rise through authoritarian populists of a system of illiberal democracy or democracy without rights, in which people say, I stand for the people, I'm gonna put the people's preferences into political reality, even if it does violate the rights of minorities, even if it does abolish independent institutions. But obviously that does mean that people's rights get violated, and that over the long run, we are no longer able to remove democratically elected governments through democratic means, because there's no independent press, there's no independent courts, and so on and so forth.
So why now for this moment?
I can ask you to put your hands over the table.
Oh, okay, sure. Sì, forse quello sarebbe più semplice. Così? Ok.
So why are we experiencing this crisis and this upsurge of populism now?
Well, I think it's actually been happening for. Oh, we're not going to hear your question, right?
No.
Okay, so ask the question again.
Well, they'll hear it. They'll probably splice it as. But so why are you experiencing this crisis in democracy now and this upsurge of populism?
So it's tempting to think that populism is a very recent phenomenon, because it's only since 2016 that in some of the biggest countries, most salient countries, we have had these very striking victories by populists. Actually, when you look at the data, it's been rising slowly over time. You've seen the rise for the last decades. In the year 2000, for example, populists took about 6% of the vote in European countries. Now they take about 27, 28%. And that's been a relatively steady rise. So I think we need to look at explanations that both apply across different countries and that apply not just since 2016, not just since 2008, but before that. And there's three big important ones, I think. The first is the stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens. The second is the slow transition from a sort of quite hierarchical societies with a mono-ethnic, monocultural conception of themselves to more truly multi-ethnic societies. And the third is the rise of the internet and of social media, which makes it easier for extreme voices to exploit some of the frustrations that parts of the population have about these developments in order to mount extreme challenges to the status quo.
I think for me, one of the most scary moments in the last several years is when I read in the New York Times your study on perceptions of democracy among the young. That the young are the most skeptical, not just in the United States, but in many other countries. Why do you think that is, and do you think that trend will hold?
So there's a general development in not every, but many countries in Western Europe and North America of people becoming more disillusioned with their democracies. And it's particularly pronounced among the young, but it actually exists to some extent among all of them. And so we see in many countries that people have give less importance now to living in a democracy than they used to, but they're more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. For example, among all respondents in France and Britain, about 25% of people said it's good to have a strong ruler who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections 20 years ago. Now it's 1 in 2, so it's roughly doubled. There's a few reasons for that. One is that the memory of actual alternatives to democracy is receding into the past, so people no longer have a live imagination of what it means to live under or fight fascism. They no longer have a live imagination of what it means to live under or fight communism. And another is that our political systems haven't delivered as much as they have in the past. A big part of how democracies work is output legitimacy. That people say, hey, I like the system because you know what? My life's pretty good, it's better than my parents' was, it's going to get better still. Well, we haven't, across a whole set of different indicators, done nearly as well as we might on making sure that we live up to those expectations.
And just final question, with these type of broad, deep, really transformational type of challenges you're talking about, are there steps, effective steps that political leaders or activists can take, or are we effectively along for the ride on this great transformation that we're not in control?
So we are along for the ride in a sense. We're not easily in control, but there are things we can do. So the first thing we have to do in order to stand up to those dangerous authoritarian populists is to fight them in elections. We've seen in many countries that once they're in power, they can do tremendous damage. And when they're first up for re-election, the opposition still retains a realistic, though probably no longer even chance of beating them. Once populists have been re-elected a couple of times, they manage to skew the playing field so much through illiberal measures that it becomes essentially impossible for the opposition to displace them through free and fair elections. And so in the short run, standing up to them at the polling booth, uniting the opposition, running the strongest candidates, everybody getting involved makes a huge difference. But there's also long-term factors that I've outlined. So we also have to make sure that elites, for example, actually take seriously that they need to ensure that ordinary citizens see economic improvements, because it is in their existential interest to ensure that's the case, to have a stable political and economic system. We need to make sure that we fight for a truly multi-ethnic democracy, which in my mind means an inclusive patriotism, in which rather than abusing nationalism in order to exclude some people, as the political right does, or running away from patriotism altogether, which part of the left are increasingly tempted to do, we actually fight for the interpretation of what it means to be American, or Italian, or German, or Swedish, depending on which country you're in. And the third is that we can't beat back social media. We can't censor it effectively. I don't think that works. There certainly has to be more regulation, but it's never going to quite contain the freedom that we have on those platforms, and nor should it. But we can actually fight for our political values. We haven't taken seriously in the last decades teaching students civics, telling them about the values of our political system, trying to transmit those from one generation to the next. Doing that is not going to be a panacea, but it is certainly something that's going to make a difference, and we should recommit ourselves to our values and to the task of communicating them in a very new way. So look, I can't promise anybody a happy end, but we have a lot of agency. We still have the luck and the privilege to live in societies in which we're not threatened with going to jail for speaking up and for organizing. And so together we have quite a lot of impact we can make, and it's our duty to use that freedom now in order to preserve it for all of us in the long run.
Wonderful. Anything else you'd like to add? Dante? Thank you.
Bitte. All right. So, right.